All right, here's our outline. We'll do the case for change, the sciences of learning, principles to a model, the data, and frontiers. So we can go forth, and again, I hope to provoke. In the case for change, there are three things to consider. One is the Flexner Report of April of 1910. One is this notion of ethical erosion. And one are these sciences of learning. And we'll just take them in turn. It doesn't take so long. And if you speak this quickly, it doesn't take long at all, right? So Flexner. What happened was, in April of 1910, Abraham Flexner got to see the Canadian and the U.S. medical schools, far more numerous back then, and because of him, there were fewer of them, but certain kind of stipulations led to core Flexnerian ideas. Here's the thing. The devil quoteth Flexner to serve his needs. So I don't want to do that. I want to give you what is, I think, not to be too easily argued, really core Flexner. Here are three. He highly valued the idea of the continuity of the teachers with their students. He highly valued the closeness the students could follow their individual patients, and he highly valued students engaging with patients who represented or who had the diversity of conditions that affected the public health. And in April of 1910, that would have been done in big hospitals. This idea of an ambulatory environment was not the state of affairs back then for learning. In 2010 or 2015, and frankly, probably even in the 1990s, it was no longer true that to get these things done, that you would have chosen a large tertiary hospital to do it. So I come from a school that prizes its large tertiary hospitals and prizes science. I think this probably is not different than here. But I think it's, again, in order to be provocative, let me say, the venues of care now are different. How different are they? In the U.S., less than 1%. That's less than 1% of all healthcare delivery happens in the large academic health centers. Yet we train the vast majority of students in those health centers, not only seeming strange on its face, but also obviously violating Flexner. So that for us was a case for change. The learning sciences. So it turns out for us it was a third case for change, and I'll show you how this unfolds. We had thought this idea of continuity mattered. It's kind of cool to be in this crowd. You seem to think that relationships and continuity matter too. But behind this notion of continuity, the continuity of the care of the patient and the continuity of this developmentally progressive, rationally laid out curriculum, the continuity with the teachers and supervisors, and the continuity of the idealism, behind that is actually sciences of learning. So continuity is cute, but learning sciences are cuter. All right. So have we said relationships today a few times? That was one of the words. I held back. I didn't go to the mic, right? It was one of the words. And also this notion of longitudinal and integrated. So I'll get into those for a second, because in a scientific crowd like this, we should do some learning science. All right. Here's a paper from 2010 from Educational Researcher. It's a review of learning sciences, and the papers that are cited within it are quite helpful if you want to get into some dense science of learning stuff. If it's too dense and drives you crazy, you could just read the book Make It Stick by Brown, Rudiger, and McDaniel. Make It Stick is all the rage now south of the border. And I just want to say that there's this idea of learning theory. Learning theories may end up being proved empirically, but there's also learning sciences, things that involved empirical study. So I'm going to go into the latter category for a moment. I realize many of you know this stuff, but just quickly. Longitudinal, we said, the learning sciences say spacing learning. Integrated, we said, the learning sciences say interleaving. So I'm going to use these words in that way. Okay, so longitudinal design creates the opportunity to space out learning. I put this thing mind the gap. I just want to tell you, I grew up in a place that had no subways. And when I moved to Boston, I saw this mind the gap notion for the trains. Now, you guys are sophisticated city people. I was not. I didn't, like, what gap? And did mind mean to be bothered by? I should mind the gap. I didn't get it. But I get it now. I'm safe on trains, and I also understand it here. There are gaps, potentially, between when you study and when you restudy. There are gaps between when you finally study and when you actually have to know this stuff. So for the idea of learning, spacing learning, let's think of these gaps. The first gap between study and restudy is the study gap. The other gap between when you ultimately conclude study and when you have to actually know something is called test delay. Now you think about it, the test delay in medicine is often the test of life. Like, you learn stuff in med school, you may deploy in residency. You learn stuff in residency, you may deploy after residency. You learn stuff in November, you may have to do it in, actually, heaven forbid, June, right? So there can be substantial test delay. But strangely, with block rotations, there's very little study gapping. So let's see what this all plays out in a very disturbing 3D graph. No panicking, I'll take us through it. All right, we're going to look at the gaps. Okay, that's the 3D graph. It's okay. So what we'll do here is we're going to go up here to the northeast, way up here. Integrated design allows what's called interleaving. So we know this idea of blocking by type. Learn one thing, learn one thing, learn one thing, stop. Learn the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, stop. The last thing, the last thing, the last thing, stop. All right? How many of you speak a second language? If he asks in Canada, knowing, of course, yes. How many of you speak a third language? Outstanding 3-language learners. All right, we're going to get back to you in 1 second, you 3-language learner devils. Here we go. Interleaving would say not A, B, 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 C, 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 but A, B, C, B, C, A, C, A, B. You're mixing multiple things simultaneously. There are developmental pediatricians in the room, at least one. There are other pediatricians in the room too. They know about this next thing well. So if a child speaks multiple languages simultaneously as a little person, and they keep doing it, those children have speech delay in all 3 of those languages for a while. And if they keep going, they catch up in all 3 of those languages. They end up being, like, I don't know, let's say the English, French, Mandarin speaking person who speaks 3. They can be equal in English, equal in French, equal in Mandarin to someone who speaks only 1 of those or only 2 of those, if they just keep going with all 3 simultaneously, interleaving, multiple things simultaneously. It's way cooler than that. So those of you who know English and or French and or Mandarin also know that Turkish is nothing like those, right? Or Russian. If you were to if you were to teach this 3-language learning child now Turkish or Russian, let's say, they're more facile at learning that language than someone who spoke 2 languages or 1, unless the other person had a Turkic language, right? So they're not just equal now in all 3 languages. They also have 3, no less, right? They have 3, but they're also better at language generally. Interleaving has a very powerful effect. Better yet, interleaving boosts the effect of spacing. So if you spacing out is one idea, but you can stuff different things in between and make the spacing effect more powerful by interleaving. He's making an argument. The speaker is making an argument about the idea of doing longitudinal integrated. He's just being sneaky about it. All right, let's see the spacing of the interleaving effect for 1 second. If you learn things in blocks and you're tested 5 minutes later, blocks win. Cramming actually works for 5 minutes later. It turns out after only 1 week, this is but one example, but there are myriad examples of this across many domains of learning. The retention drops down to 20% or worse at 1 week. In block learning, in massed learning, whereas interleaving sustains, right? So there's something to be said for spacing, interleaving. And you see, we already know this, right? Because we would never do math for 8 weeks and then no more math. And then English for 8 weeks and no more English and no more math. It doesn't sound this way to you, but I actually had English for 12 years, right? I'm teasing my own English. Anybody? That was not even a giggle. All right. The point is, I had it for 12 years. I don't speak real well. You wouldn't do math for 8 weeks and no more math, and English for 8 weeks and no more English and no more math. You wouldn't then do biology for 8 weeks and then no more biology. Imagine you throw in tennis for 8 weeks and then no more tennis ever again. You're not good at tennis a year later. Or math, or English, right? We don't do that. We always imagined spacing, interleaving as normal. That's what we did throughout all of our schooling until we went to medical school. So we are familiar with the top. We're unfamiliar with the bottom, even though it's sort of the normal thing to us prior to med school. So let's look at this longitudinal integrated or spaced and interleaved way. But let's look at it in psychiatry. When you have but a field, and it can go along over time, you have lots of opportunities. So for my friend Todd Griswold, who leads the psychiatry component at Cambridge, there's all of these things in the yellow blobs below that you can have students learn in a developmentally progressive way. You can rationalize where certain things should be expected and learned and assessed, right? You have all sorts of experiences that go along a longitudinal trajectory, but the truth of the matter is the core is this notion, this blue line, this longitudinal time with patients and preceptors. So let's break into that for a second. We're familiar with this, right? We're not so familiar with having a cohort where you can do that. And there's a huge difference because this objectifies, or as the anthropologists say, reifies, it objectifies the patient as only their sickest version of themselves in one particular venue of their whole life, this inpatient thing. So those 2 beds also moved me when I saw the 2 beds. But what occurred to me was in those beds is not the whole being, it's the sick being. No less on a particular floor at a particular time with a particular set of specialists. It's a very pale, wan view of a human being. But this, whoop, I went the wrong way. That, with the line, into the hospital, out of the hospital, completely healthy, completely not healthy. It's the whole trajectory of someone's real lived life, right? And then you can do it, of course, by making, as Flexner asked us to do, a deliberate cohort that reflects the issues affecting the public health. If you look at those, many of them, like the purple person and the yellow person there, they're never in the hospital. If you want to treat those conditions or be in the real lived life of those conditions as a provider, you aren't doing it in the hospital necessarily. And then you can imagine how this would look in pediatrics or internal medicine. Imagine a student with a whole cohort, not in but one discipline, but in many disciplines. And then imagine this. You can follow patients through all the venues of care, because ultimately that person on top could be me. So let's think about this. If I were well and then got depression, did I just convert from an internal medicine patient into a psych patient? Like, did somebody just, or is it still me? Like, we make these disciplines to, I don't know, organize funds flows and to have a peer group, the tribes we talk about, or maybe to hold some kind of canon in a separate space than another canon. But there's only the being, the full being, who, it seems to me, didn't turn into a depressed patient or turned into a psych patient. It's just the same person. They now have another affliction to have to deal with. It feels kind of MPA-ish to me, I might say. So I'm very sensitive to the idea that if you can imagine the patient as the organizing principle, you don't objectify them. Maybe you fight off this ethical erosion. And then you also have this cool thing where and I love this metaphor since I've done a lot of work in Australia as well, where you actually can surf. I'm going to define the metaphor. You get your surfboard, you go out on the pier, or maybe you go out in the water, you stand there with your surfboard, and the waves come by you. Right? You're good to go, and the waves come by you. That's not surfing. If you really want to know the wave, right, you paddle out, and you ride the wave to the shore. Are we lost in the metaphor? You're located, and the patients are coming by you. You're the organizing principle. You and your surfboard field. You are the organizing principle. Patients come through you. But if you're out on the water surfing, you are riding along with the patient. The patient's energy allows you to go forth, right? We shall surf. If the shores of Lake Ontario get to be so you can surf on them, bad things are happening to the environment. But the metaphor holds up. All right. If I don't show a graph of the actual grid, nobody believes me. Please, we can get into the graph if you want to. The bottom line is you see multiple disciplines simultaneously. Right? There's a more elegant version out in the hallway on that beautiful poster, I must say. But here's a primitive version of one, longitudinal clerkship. There's space for following your patients longitudinally. There's different clinics at once over the course of a week. There's some didactics, probably not nearly as good as the link didactics. Another excellent poster outside. But just to say that longitudinal design can happen. So that probably says something. I just want to make sure you don't get too Harvardized here. It's a curse sometimes, right? So if you look at these kind of things across the literature, not just at Harvard, not just in the U.S., not just in the U.S. and Canada, but sort of worldwide, here's the notion. And Lucy Walters and others, but Lucy Walters in particular, summarized it quite brilliantly. CIC, LIC students do as well or better on tests of medical knowledge and skills. And there's a number of different ways. I showed you some of the US ways. There's ways in Canada, ways in Australia as well. And these have been shown, these results shown nationally, internationally, in multiple different contexts of LICs, across different kinds of venues of LICs, different kinds of LICs, different models, and across substantial time. And reviews of the subject have shown the same. But there's more than just this kind of stuff. There's also this kind of stuff. Like LICs have been shown across the world now to foster professional values, to improve the student experiences and their perceptions and their satisfaction, like I showed you. There's benefits for faculty and for the actual practices that the faculty preceptors are in, for patients and for communities. Some really cool studies in Australia and Canada about that. Looking at workforce imperatives in the US, even in the US, we have workforce imperatives, but certainly in Canada and Australia and beyond. Results shown into residency and beyond. And benefits in psychiatry in particular. So this is where we're going to sort of get to now. Here's a student who's going to speak about an experience he had, his perspective on medicine, but it serves also as a metaphor for how we can understand our healthcare system, I think. So let's see what Ben has to say.
As soon as I am asked to formalize a patient's case in giving a presentation or writing a patient note, it feels like a betrayal of the patient's life and story, and a betrayal of the genuine interaction I just had with that patient. I may have just spent an hour with this person learning about their most private feelings and experiences, and then I am obligated to prioritize and filter out the majority of this information. It's like I just took all those real human feelings and emotions contained in that patient-doctor interaction, and I crammed them, reorganized them, and dehydrated them to fit into a succinct little box. Often, the content of the note or presentation depends more on what the attending wants to hear than on what the patient has told me, especially if the attending is more biomedically oriented. I sometimes get angry just thinking about this, but I also see the need to be able to do this. Efficiency, uniform standards, and objective representation of patients are essential to providing the best patient care. Now, at the end of my 3rd year, I've come to the point where it's easy to sum up a patient's case in a few lines. But I still feel the importance of seeing the patient's person as a whole entity, and I hope never to forget how to do that.
So I think that he's right. We are our biological selves and we are our emotional and our social selves. I think just as we as learners can lose the capacity to see that emotional and social self amidst the biological, so too can our system, at least if I understood the morning's presentations correctly. There's a system point here, there's a personal point here. I have to say I dare think there's an LIC point here, because people are not separated into their sickest selves, and they're not separated even into a discipline. The patient is the organizing principle. So with that, I hope I can have provoked you adequately and kept you awake enough. I thank you to Toronto. Thank you.